It is late spring of 1756, and Benjamin Chambers stands within his compound here at Falling Springs. His humble gristmill business and his home has transformed over the past couple years. Once a center of commerce and business within the Conacajig settlement on the western outskirts of the province of Pennsylvania, his community has begun to shrink. After the defeat of Braddock's British army by a small French and Indian force, Native American attacks on this Pennsylvania frontier caused the death and capture of hundreds of people. The Great Cove, just beyond those mountains in the distance, fell first. Then, Native raiders attacked the privately owned but government-operated Fort McDowell this past winter and surrounded the privately owned and defended Fort McCord and burned it to the ground. Many women and children were captured and taken west in that attack. The militia has been no help. They were bested in battle at the Barr Farm, and Culbertson's force was destroyed in April. The settlement asked for arms to be used against their attacking foe, but no help was ever granted. What guns that were received from the provincial government were rusted beyond repair. So far, the British failed to aid the frontier, and so did Pennsylvania. These people out here on the frontier, they were truly on their own. Ben Chambers glances around as he takes in the stockade that surrounds him. Ben is a wealthy man because of his family and his business ventures here on the frontier. He made his life along these waters of Falling Springs and on this fruitful land here in the Cumberland Valley. As many of his neighbors flee east, away from the frontier and away from the attacks and war that gripped their community, Ben is doubling down. He built a stockade around his mill and home, which had access to clean running water. He has received some supplies such as 2 small swivel guns and powder and lead from the government, but that was not nearly enough. He has even covered with lead the roof of a 2-story stone building within his fort, so fire could not claim the location of his last stand if the French and Indian forces did somehow breach his walls. Fort Chambers was the strongest fort in the settlement thanks to his wealth, and he built it not only to protect himself and his family, but also his neighbors that were building a community around him. As thousands flee the war-torn frontier, Ben planned to defend it to the last. If the government was not going to protect these hardy people, he would. He looked about his fort one last time. Something is missing to complete the defenses. Ah, yes, cannons would be of help. There would be no way that a force could surround and take this fort if he had cannons firing scatter shot at them. With a smile, Ben thought, you know what? I know exactly where I can get some. I have covered the start of this war in detail in other videos, but I will give a brief rundown to get you up to speed and also direct you to my previous videos for more information on the subject. The North American theater, the 7 Years' War between the great nations of France and Britain, the French and Indian War, had its start in what is now western Pennsylvania with a young George Washington firing on French soldiers. After his defeat, the British sent in General Edward Braddock in 1755 to take the French Fort Duquesne in modern-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today. This was a disastrous campaign that led to the destruction of Braddock's forces and the loss of his own life at the hands of the French and their Native American allies. After this disaster, the British retreated to Philadelphia, leaving the frontier completely defenseless from any kind of British military protection. In the fall of 1755, the Great Cove, modern-day Fulton County, Pennsylvania, was decimated by Native American attacks, killing and capturing hundreds of men, women, and children, and burning farm buildings and crops and killing livestock. In response, many people of means began to fortify their homes in preparation of Indian raiding parties attacking their farms and their communities. Ben Chambers, one of these people of means, already started his fortifications. February 1756 saw the home of David Davis attacked. The mill-turned-fort, Fort McDowell, was assaulted, and it also saw the failed attempts of Colonel John Armstrong's Pennsylvania militia, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to defend this valley. Ben Chambers' Conagajig settlement was front and center to these attacks. In April, Fort McCord was surrounded and burned, capturing many women and children in that attack. The destruction was real and only continued to get worse. After the destruction of Fort Granville, a provincial fort on the Juniata River, on July 30th, 80% of the people of the Cumberland Valley dropped their farming tools and fled east, away from the Indian raids, despite good weather producing good crops here in the fields of the Cumberland Valley. This is reflected by the September 6, 1756 address by Adam Hoopes to the Pennsylvania Assembly, who said in 1755 there were 3,000 men fit to bear arms in the valley, but now there were no more than 100 men, despite an abundant harvest growing in the fields. The skills of the native war parties at killing not only citizens but soldiers was illustrated well by James Garbreth, who wrote on August 10, 1756, about 5 miles above me at Manana Gap, there were 2 of the province soldiers killed, 1 wounded. There were but 3 Indians, and they came in amongst 10 of our men and committed the murder, and went off safe. The name or sight of an Indian makes almost all mankind in these parts to tremble. Their barbarity is so cruel where they are masters, for by all appearance the devil commits, God permits, and the French pays. And by this, the back parts, by all appearance, will be laid waste by flight, especially Cumberland County. It was this reality that Ben Chambers faced. Leave his home and his growing business and community that he worked so hard to create, or stand and fight. Ben chose the latter. According to Ben's grandson, George Chambers, Benjamin Chambers built a large stone dwelling house surrounded by the water from falling springs. He says, the dwelling house, for greater security against the attempts of the Indians to fire it, was roofed with lead. The dwellings and the mill were surrounded by a stockade fort. This fort, with the aid of firearms, a blunderbuss, and swivel, was so formidable to the Indian parties who passed the country that it was seldom assailed. Other descriptions say that the wall on this house was so thick that it repelled log battering rams, and the windows were narrow to allow muskets to fire at outside attackers. The compound was surrounded by a high stockade that was about 300 foot long and about 90 foot wide, enclosing the stone house, the outbuildings, and mills of his business within the safety of a wall. This also allowed room for local citizens of his community to build small huts within the stockade for safety in case of an Indian raid. The fort also had an access to a waterway in case of a siege. The inhabitants of the fort would have access to fresh water and, of course, waste removal. According to various sources, in the fall of 1756, the fort was defended by small arms such as muskets and rifles, a blunderbuss, 2 small swivel guns provided by the provincial government in December of 1755, and finally, 2 mounted 4-pound cannons. Though we have no historical proof to where Ben acquired his 2 4-pound cannons, we know that cannons were moving about the area at the time. At this time, 4-pound cannons were obsolete, and were being replaced by militaries of empires with 6-pounders, and were so readily available as military surplus that the militia forces in America had access to them. Colonel George Washington of the Virginia militia was actually given 34-pound cannons, where many of them ended up being transported via wagon to Fort Cumberland in modern-day Western Maryland. Also at this time, 4-pound cannons were moving from Philadelphia to Fort Hunter near Harris's Ferry, or modern-day Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. With Ben's wealth and influence, along with the availability of 4-pound cannons at the time, it would be very easy for Ben Chambers to acquire them. On September 8, 1756, militia leader Colonel John Armstrong and 300 Scotch-Irish men from the Cumberland Valley attacked at daylight the Lenni Lenape village of Katanning. Though a much-needed victory for the Pennsylvania militia, the results of Katanning were mixed, as the European force was scattered across the wilderness as native war parties attacked and killed many militiamen, picking them off one by one. When Colonel Armstrong returned home from attacking Katanning, he was informed that Fort Oswego along Lake Ontario in western New York was lost, along with its garrison, and the British naval power on the lake was destroyed by the French and Indian forces there. Western New York was lost to the French, and Armstrong's attack on Katanning seriously angered the Western Indian tribes. On October the 11th, 1756, Major Byrd sent an express to the Pennsylvania governor informing him that his military intelligence pointed to Western Indians, upwards of 1,000 warriors, collecting at Fort Duquesne in modern-day Pittsburgh, with the French to march on Fort Augusta on the frontier in what is now modern-day Salisbury, Pennsylvania. In the mind of the Pennsylvania militia and the British military, this was a real danger. The French were emboldened by their victories in New York as it was lost and fell to their forces. The Indians were angry about the attack on one of their major villages, and a large force of French and Indians were preparing to march onto the frontier. And a frontier that was mostly abandoned by able-bodied men and their families was now sitting unguarded and full of bounty of corn and other crops, just sitting in the fields, untouched and unharvested. If the French and Indians moved into the Cumberland Valley and got a foothold here, they had all the food and the supplies necessary and needed to refuel their efforts and move across the Susquehanna River and assault Lancaster and even possibly Philadelphia. The barrier between the civilized society of Britain and the untamed wilderness of the West would dissolve overnight, and Pennsylvania would fall like Western New York. To deal with this possible threat, Pennsylvania Governor William Denny asked for Edward Shippen of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to organize a great number of men from Lancaster and York to go to the defense of the Cumberland Valley so the valley would not fall. Edward Shippen wrote back to Governor Denny on October 15th, and he said the following: "In pursuance of your honor's kind advice to the inhabitants of this borough, a meeting was appointed to be held yesterday at the courthouse at 12 o'clock in order to agree upon a plan of marching up to Colonel Armstrong in case we should be alarmed by an account of his being attacked. But to my great astonishment, nobody appeared except the Chief Burgess and myself and 2 or 3 more, so that your honor can judge by this how insensible we are of our approaching danger, and unworthy of the good counsel you were pleased to give us. It seems no one was coming to the aid of the Cumberland Valley." James Young was appointed Commissary General with the orders to examine into the state and condition of the fort's arms, ammunition, provisions, blankets, accoutrements, tools, and other stock, and things belonging to His Majesty or the province, and remaining at such fort and with each company. Since Ben Chambers' fort housed 2 swivel guns provided by the province of Pennsylvania in the winter of 1755, James Young paid the fort a visit in the middle of October of 1756, trying to fulfill his duties. James Young, as the Commissary General, inspected Ben Chambers' fort and penned a letter while in Harris's Ferry on October the 17th, 1756 that said, "In our journey to Fort Littleton, we stopped at Mr. Chambers' mill, 10 miles beyond Shippensburg towards McDowell's, where he has a private fort, and on an exceedingly good situation to be made very defensible. But what I think of great consequence to the government is, that in said fort are 2 4-pound cannon mounted, and nobody but a few country people to defend it. If the enemy should take the fort, they would naturally bring those cannon against Shippensburg and Carlisle. I therefore presume to recommend it to your honor either to have the cannon taken from thence or a proper garrison stationed there." The issue Young saw was the 2 4-pound cannons here at Fort Chambers, if not properly defended, could be seized by the French if they captured the Cumberland Valley and could give the enemy a great advantage. These cannons could be used to blow any door open on a fort in the area. Just as the crops and the land could be used against Pennsylvania that was still here in the valley, so could these cannons. To James Young, these cannons presented a possible problem if captured by the French. Hence, his suggestion to either bring more men to defend Fort Chambers or remove the privately owned weapons. On November 30th, 1765, Colonel John Armstrong wrote to Governor Denny about the cannons. "I have wrote Mr. Chambers concerning the guns at his fort, according to order, but he thinks, by going to Philadelphia, he may prevail with your honor to let them stay where they are, and is to set out for that purpose in a few days." Well, winter set in, and the militaries of the Northern Hemisphere stopped the war for winter camp. Apparently, Ben Chambers traveled to Philadelphia to argue his case of keeping his 4-pound cannons directly to the governor. But, as future events tell, Ben was not successful. Meanwhile, Colonel Armstrong and his militia was tasked to build a fort in the Conococheague settlement that would serve to protect against the possible French and Indian attack that could be coming. Quickly built, Fort Loudon was to be the militia's main defensible position for Ben Chambers' community. With the quick erection of this fort in the terrible conditions of winter, the quality was seriously lacking. Reverend Thomas Barton wrote of Fort Loudon that it was a poor piece of work, irregularly built, and badly situated at the bottom of a hill, subject to damps and noxious vapors. It has something like bastions supported by props, which if the enemy should cut away, down tumbles, men and all. And behind me here, you'll see one of these bastions, where most forts were not quite built like this, but as you see, they're standing on props. If this was being sieged, or actually being surrounded, and they could get underneath these and chop them down, the bastion would fall down, and they have a ladder to go right up inside of the fort. And this comment by Reverend Barton is so famous that here at Fort Loudon Historical Site, they actually have his comments written on a lovely sign explaining why these bastions are not the greatest piece of engineering for military purposes. But I just found that funny seeing that sign there. That's a new addition to what I'm used to. But despite being privately funded, Ben Chambers' bigger lead-line roofed heavily armed and well-positioned fort was far superior than Armstrong's government-funded Fort Loudon. After Ben Chambers' failed attempt to argue to keep his cannons, and with the inability to raise a militia to come to the aid of the Cumberland Valley, Governor Denny ordered Colonel John Armstrong to remove Ben's 2 4-pound cannons. Despite the poor quality of the quickly built Fort Loudon and the failures of the militia, Armstrong was to become the new caretaker of Ben's privately owned cannons. It was the lack of government help that caused Ben Chambers to purchase these great guns, and he planned to defend his home on the frontier with his personal weapons, no matter if he received help or not. If Pennsylvania wanted his guns, Ben was willing to fight to keep them. The winter of 1756 and 1757 saw general hysteria gripping Pennsylvania as the French and Indian threat loomed. An escaped Indian captive named Henry Hess was debriefed of his experiences among the Lenni Lenape. Hess informed his examiners that he overheard a Lenni Lenape chief encourage a runaway African-American slave to go among the inhabitants and persuade his fellow slaves to kill their masters, because the Indians would be in the woods to receive the murderous slaves and provide them comfort among the Indian tribes in the West. When word of this got out, fears of a slave uprising would have gripped the hearts of slave owners, fearing that their deaths were imminent. In late 1755, Britain began to remove the French Canadians of Nova Scotia and distributed them across the American colonies. About 350 of them were dropped off in Philadelphia. Fearing that these Catholic Free French men may still have loyalties to their ancestral country of France, on March 21st, 1757, Governor William Denny ordered for several of these men to be arrested for being suspicious and evil-minded persons. A separate order on the same day targeted a free Frenchman from Nova Scotia named Francis Inglis, late of Conacajig in the county of Cumberland. He was a traveling shoemaker, who is described as hath committed many notorious breaches of his Majesty's peace, as well in this province as in the province of Maryland. Francis was charged with encouraging the back inhabitants to settle among the French. In other words, Governor Denny felt Francis was encouraging the remaining population of the Cumberland Valley, including Benjamin Chambers, to not resist the French and accept their takeover of the Conacajig settlement and the whole Cumberland Valley, basically surrendering. The fear of a Catholic uprising was so great that they began to count the Catholic presence in the city of Philadelphia and in the province, and brought several Roman Catholic men to the Chief Justice for examination. According to the Pennsylvania Archives, Series 1, Volume 3, page 105, Governor Denny, on February the 4th, 1757, issued an order to Colonel John Armstrong to cause the said 2 cannon to be removed from the dwelling house of the said Benjamin Chambers to Shippensburg or some other fort under his command as a place of safety, where they might be secure from falling into the hands of the enemy. The account says that Armstrong sent troops under the command of Thomas Smallman to confiscate the 2 cannons from Ben Chambers. When the force faced Ben and his neighborhood, the settlers of the Conacajig settlement refused to give up the 2 4-pound mounted cannons and threatened to kill Smallman and his force if they decided to try to take the cannons by force. Governor Denny said that he had reason to believe that the said Benjamin Chambers is disaffected to his Majesty and his government. He possibly believed that the words of the French freeman Francis convinced Chambers to side with the French when they advanced into this vacant valley at the time. However, in reality, Ben was defending what he viewed as his right to his own property and his ability to defend himself, his family, his property, and his community. With this word of Benjamin Chambers' so-called treachery by refusing to give up his cannons, Governor Denny issued the following order to the sheriff of Cumberland County. The Honorable William Denny, Esquire, Lieutenant Governor and Commander-in-Chief of the Province of Pennsylvania and counties of Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex on Delaware. To the Sheriff of Cumberland County, greeting. Whereas it having been represented to me that 2 great guns or cannon were in the custody and possession of a certain Benjamin Chambers at his dwelling house on the western frontier of this province, in the said county of Cumberland, where they did lie exposed to his Majesty's enemies, who by taking possession of them might thereby be the better enabled to annoy and distress his said Majesty's subjects in this province, and to lay siege to and reduce his Majesty's forts. Therein, moved by my duty to my sovereign, and a regard and concern for the safety of the people of this province, under my command, care, and protection, I issued my order in writing bearing date on or about the 4th day of February last past, directed to Lieutenant Colonel John Armstrong, thereby commanding him to cause the said 2 cannon to be removed from the dwelling house of the said Benjamin Chambers to Shippensburg or some other fort under his command as a place of safety, where they might be secure from falling into the hands of the enemy. And whereas it has been proved to my satisfaction that the said John Armstrong did send a party of His Majesty's forces under the command of Thomas Smallman to remove the said cannon accordingly, and that the said Benjamin Chambers, with an intent to disturb the King's peace himself, did assemble with divers other persons unknown, armed with swords, guns, and other warlike weapons, and riotously, traitorously, and seditiously, without any lawful authority, did oppose the march of the said Thomas Smallman and the other forces under his command, would not suffer them to execute my said order, and did not only refuse to deliver up the said cannon, but did threaten to kill the said Smallman or any of the said forces who should offer to take possession of the said cannon, and I have reason to believe that the said Benjamin Chambers is disaffected to His Majesty and his government. You are therefore hereby strictly charged and commanded to take the body of the said Benjamin Chambers and bring him under a strong guard before me, the said William Denny, Esquire, at the city of Philadelphia, to answer the premises and be dealt with according to law, and all officers civil and military and others His Majesty's subjects in this province are hereby ordered and charged to be aiding and assisting to you therein. Hereof fail not, and you will answer the contrary at your peril, and for your so doing this shall be your warrant, given under my hand and seal at arms at Philadelphia, the 5th day of April, and 13th year of His Majesty's reign, William Denny. With the issue of this warrant for the arrest of Benjamin Chambers, the magistrates of Cumberland County, who were the representatives of the governor in the matter of policing and behavior of the citizens of the province, were compelled to comply with the warrant. So what did the magistrates do? They all resigned, refusing to arrest a man defending his community with his own fortune. On June 30th, 1757, John Armstrong, while in Carlisle, wrote, "It's thought Chambers now designs a lawsuit, and he has said the action will be brought against me where I think it cannot lie. If it's found that he designs trouble, as he has the brass and malice of the devil, I think the governor should write to Colonel Stanwix. In the meantime, I will open the matter to the colonel, who may think it necessary to seize the guns himself." Colonel Stanwix was in charge of the Royal Americans, who were official British soldiers that arrived in Carlisle just before Armstrong wrote this letter. Armstrong believed that the governor still wanted the cannons. He suggested to have the redcoats take them. Armstrong continues that the task of fixing the new magistrates is a very hard one, and he later says, The old magistrates had no other reason for resigning than least they should be left out, except Justice Wilson, who did it on account of his private affairs, though some of them I have lately heard say it was owing to the governor's treatment of Ben Chambers in regard of his guns. As a side note, Armstrong mentions a particular candidate to become a magistrate. His name is Mr. William Smith, who becomes a leader using his role as magistrate in the future Black Boy Rebellion 8 years later. See my series on the Black Boy Rebellion for more info on that one. Ben Chambers, sitting inside of his well-fortified home and place of business that used to be right here, was never arrested, and the matter eventually settled down as the threat of French and Indian invasion declined. The French and Indians never swarmed the Cumberland Valley as was suspected, but several successful Indian raids occurred in 1758, but hostilities further slowed after the British and militia forces finally captured Fort Duquesne on November 24th of 1758. With the threat minimizing, Chambers' cannons were no longer an issue, and the arrest warrant was never successfully executed. Most historians of the 19th and 20th centuries have claimed that the dispute between Pennsylvania and Ben Chambers was over the swivel guns that he received in December of 1755, not actual cannons. They feel that the government was in their right to take these swivel guns, for they provided them to Ben in the first place. First, a swivel gun is very different from a 4-pound cannon. And actually, we're lucky enough here at Fort Loudon, they have one of their swivel guns mounted up here on their bastion. So you get an idea of what a swivel gun looks like and how it would have been mounted. But a swivel gun was usually small and could be mounted on a fort wall, just like the one behind me here. It usually was about 3 foot long, weighed about 150 pounds, and had a 5/8 inch bore. A 4-pound cannon was usually a lot bigger, could be around 6 foot long, maybe a little shorter, weighing around 600 pounds, and had roughly a 3.5 inch bore, and it fired a 4-pound round ball. Being so large and having the ability to fire such a large ball required it to be mounted on a carriage of some sort with wheels to allow for recoil. A gun this large could not be mounted like the swivel gun behind me, or with the first shot fired, the recoil would most likely break it loose from its stand and the wall that it's mounted on, and it would just fall off. So when they're talking about two 4-pound cannons versus a swivel gun, there is a clear difference here. And with the help of my friends from Fort Loudon Historical Site, this is what a swivel gun sounds like going off.
Stop! Get fire!
And this is what a 4-pound cannon sounds like going off.
Have a care!
Wooden stock that you see right there.
As you can see, clear difference. By thinking these disputed guns were swivels, all these historians are violating the logic and not properly reading the primary sources. John Armstrong refers to the weapons in question as guns. Governor William Denny refers to them as great guns or cannons, which he says could be used to reduce local forts. And James Young, a commissary general in charge of government facilities and armaments, should obviously know the difference between the tiny swivel gun and the hefty 4-pounder, which he describes specifically in his report as two 4-pound cannons mounted. Not once were these guns described as swivels. On the contrary, they were described as the larger cannons. Furthermore, a swivel gun, or two for that matter, posed no threat to towns or forts, yet the guns in question were mentioned by Young and Denny as posing a threat to both towns and forts if they were captured by the French. Despite the arrest warrant and the dishonor that some ancestors may feel about it, The bottom line of this story is Benjamin Chambers was a hero. With the failures of the militia, the Pennsylvania provincial government, and the British military, Ben Chambers was willing to put up not only his fortune, but his life to defend his community. With great expense, he built a fort far superior than what Pennsylvania created. He armed his community members with guns that Pennsylvania would not provide, and he purchased his own private artillery to combat the French and Indian threat. Though none of this was needed, thank God, he was prepared for the worst. But despite the obvious failures of Pennsylvania, they insulted Ben by threatening to take away his personal property that allowed him to defend himself when the government failed to do so. When that backfired, the government threatened his very freedom and was going to arrest him. These are issues that are discussed in the language and logic behind the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution. As time passed, Ben Chambers became a supporter of the American Revolution, religious freedom, and turned his community he fought to defend into Chamberstown that would eventually be renamed Chambersburg, which is where I'm at right now, almost in the center of town of Chambersburg. Now, behind me here is the statue called the Homecoming, and it is actually Benjamin Chambers greeting his son and grandson after they come back from 6 years of being in the Revolutionary War, showing how much he supported independence. Now, as for his cannons, we can only speculate, but we know that an artillery unit called Chambers's Artillery was created from the people of Chambersburg at the beginning of the Civil War. And one secondary source claims that in the early to mid 1800s, one of these cannons was fired in Chambersburg to commemorate the 4th of July. Ben lived a long life, dying in February 17th, 1788 at the age of 80. To this day, the many deeds of Ben Chambers touched the lives of so many through the churches that he supported, the town that he built, and the lives that he saved. Throughout history, his name of Chambers was worn proud by his ancestors, both as a surname and a given name, and proudly shouted out by his community in the form of Chambersburg, even when the town was burnt to the ground during the Civil War. Yet few know that this proud name may have been lost to history if it wasn't for 2 4-pound cannons mounted. Thank you for watching this video. Please see my sources throughout this video and in the description below. I would also like to note the principal research for this story was done proudly by my father, Calvin Bricker Jr., a personal project of his that he completed 16 years ago. Thanks, Dad, for letting me share your job well done. Also, a big thank you to Richard Landis and also the Fort Loudon Historical Society for demonstrating their guns and also allowing me to come here and see this fort. Check out their Market Fair and War Across the Centuries events where you can see everything from cannon demonstrations, tanks, jeeps, general living history, all kinds of interesting things. Also, please check out my other videos on the French and Indian War, period, to further dive into the history that surrounded these events and gather a better understanding of a misrepresented but important time in American history. Remember, these stories are ours, and it is our duty to keep those stories alive. Join me next time as I explore What in the History.